How do you determine when a being is sentient? How do you know, for instance, that I'm sentient? Notice you cannot experience my experiences. You can only experience your own experiences. But the question is, how do you determine that another being other than yourself is sentient or not, so that you could go on to give that being's interests, if they are our interests, equal consideration? How do you make that determination? Um, well, again, let's go back to the case of myself. How would you determine that I'm sentient? For example, let's say, I was cooking dinner tonight, and, I went to go put my hand down on the counter. And by mistake, I put my hand on the stove burner, which was on high heat. I would probably, if I was a sentient being, scream out in pain, right? Ah, my hand, ow, I need to put it under cold water, right? And so you would say, oh, Sean, you must have experienced a lot of pain and suffering just now. You're a sentient being. And I can determine that. I can know that because of your behavior, because of your external actions. Okay? Notice in that moment, you did not feel my pain and suffering literally. You did not feel the heat on your hand and the burning sensation. I felt that. And you determined that I was sentient merely because of my behavior. If I would have put my hand on the burner that was on high heat, and I would have just said, yeah, how's it going? Just resting my hand on a stove burner. What's up? You would begin to question whether or not I was sentient, because you would expect different behavior. You expect me to scream out in pain. So Gavrik Matheny argues that we need to take that same line of thought and apply it to animals. How do we determine if a cow is sentient? How do we determine if a chicken is sentient? How do we determine if a rat or a bunny rabbit is sentient? You merely have to look at and observe their behavior. And when you do that, it is clear that all of these different kinds of animals are sentient. Cows, chickens, pigs, lamb, fish, rats, bunnies, dogs, cats, elephants, giraffes, etc., are all sentient beings, and you can determine that based on their behavior. For example, something some of you may be familiar with, sometimes when you are walking your dog, you accidentally step on the dog's paw. And the dog doesn't just sit there saying, yo, you're on my paw. He or she will scream out in pain. They'll, yo, yo! They'll yelp, right, in pain. And you know immediately, oh, my poor doggy, I hurt you, I'm so sorry. And you console it like you would a human being who is sentient, right? So basically, this just leads to the conclusion that non-human animals are sentient, and thus those interests, the sentient interests of these various animals, must be given equal consideration to the interests, or I should say, equal consideration relative to the interests of human beings. When humans are making decisions about how we ought to act and what kinds of practices we want to use in society, we must not only consider our own interests and how we will be affected positively or negatively, but we must also consider the interests of other non-human animals. And that may mean that we need to alter or completely cease some of our practices that employ non-human animals. The sentient interests of animals must be given equal consideration to the sentient interests of human beings. Now, someone might try to reply that, excuse me, the interests of human beings, the sentient interests of human beings, deserve different treatment than the sentient interests of animals, because those sentient interests are not exactly equal or identical. Someone might try to argue that the sentient interests of humans are somehow deeper or more intense, that humans suffer more deeply or more meaningfully than animals do because of our, for let's say, greater intelligence, right? Someone may try to argue that way, that human sentient interests are deeper and different than animal sentient interests. Matheny's response to this objection is essentially that it's also possible that the sentient interests of animals are deeper and more intense than those of human beings. And the reason for that could be that animals lack the intelligence and understanding that humans possess. In other words, there may be scenarios in which a human being is suffering, for instance, me putting my hand on the burner. But because I'm intelligent and because I'm able to understand what's happening to me, I can kind of solve that pain and suffering, right? I can say, oh, this really hurts, but I know how to make my suffering better, put my hand under some cold water, go see the doctor, etc. But an animal that is in pain and suffering cannot make sense of its own experiences. A rat or a rabbit that is being used in medical research cannot make sense of why it is being restrained, why all of its limbs are pinned to the table, and why the doctor or this, other alien being is sticking a sharp needle into the flesh, of itself. It can't make sense of that at all. Even if the aim of the research is not to cause harm to the animal doesn't understand that, whereas a human might. So that might mean that we have to actually take the sentient interests of animals even more seriously than the sentient interests of humans. Maybe we need to treat animals with more care because their sentient interests are deeper and more intense. That's an interesting conclusion that Matheny is reaching here. And as I've been saying, according to Matheny, when we equally consider the sentient interests of non-human animals, it has a serious impact on the morality of our current animal practices.